Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 154. Today's guest is Rachel Edelman. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. Today's guest is poet Rachel Edelman. Rachel Edelman is a Jewish poet who writes into diasporic living. The author of Dear Memphis, published by River Books in 2024, their poems, essays, and epistles have appeared in West Branch, Lilith, Orion, and many other journals. She has received material support from the City of Seattle's Office of Arts and Culture, Tin House, the Academy of American Poets, Crosstown Arts and Mineral School. Edelman earned a BA in English and Geology from Amherst College and an MFA in Poetry from the University of Washington. They teach language arts in the Seattle Public Schools, where embodiment and care root their personal, poetic, and pedagogical practice. So I read Rachel's debut collection, Dear Memphis, back in the spring of this year, and it was such an interesting meditation on place and community, both in terms of belonging and not belonging. The book takes its title from a series of poems that run throughout the collection, which are all in direct address to the city of Memphis, where the poem speaker is from, and to which she is returning at the beginning of the book. That epistolary quality of these poems provides a framework for the speaker to consider all kinds of questions about place and community, about heritage and inheritance, about different forms of care, about oppression and complicity. And it's the clarity and honesty of those questions that I found so compelling, not least because a lot of these are questions I often ask about my own life. I've put links in the show notes to purchase your own copy of Dear Memphis from Open Books in Seattle, from the Book Catapult here in San Diego, and from bookshop.org. As always, though, if there's an independent bookstore near you, I highly recommend ordering from there and supporting your local book community. For subscribers to our Patreon campaign, Rachel has added a reading to our bonus audio archive of one of the Dear Memphis poems from the collection that is available for subscribers for just $2 per month, along with the rest of the bonus audio archive, which includes readings from past guests, including Ada Limon, Liz Lenz, Luther Hughes, and many more, as well as many audio essays from me. You can find all of that at patreon.com/likewisemedia. Also, you'll hear in the second segment that Rachel talks about a series of letters that they wrote with poet Exile. Well, the first 12 letters in that correspondence were published in Agni in August of this year with the title, The Correspondent's Cheeks Are As a Bed of Spices. In these letters, the two poets begin by asking some of the same questions that Rachel's poems in Dear Memphis asks, questions about home and place and belonging. And then after October 7th, they turned to the war in Gaza, and the questions changed, though I suppose in some ways there is a through line. The question of how do we go on? How do we keep speaking out against the horror of genocide when the apparatus of the state is deployed to silence? There's a way that the simple closing of a letter with the word love, comma, becomes a choice, a statement, an action, an answer. I've included a link to the letters in the show notes as well, and I highly recommend checking it out. Finally, I wanted to take a moment to thank you for listening and to ask for a favor. If you enjoyed today's conversation, I deeply appreciate it if you shared it with a friend. Even better, you could take just 1 or 2 minutes to leave a 1-sentence review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser, and there are links in the show notes for that. It's just a small thing you can do to help the show reach new listeners, so thank you in advance. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Rachel Edelman. So, before I say anything else, I did want to say, reading this collection was really meaningful to me. I found it a very potent experience. I'm really glad I had the chance to read it. I've read it a couple times now to prepare for our conversation. And I was hoping that we could start with a reading.
Absolutely. And thank you for that praise. I'm going to read one of the Dear Memphis poems.
Okay.
Dear Memphis. Once my grandma's mailbox toppled in straight-line winds that tipped an old oak onto her roof, burst the tomato pots she'd lugged up the ladder. From time to time, her metal caved at the hands of someone's baseball bat. Her knobby wrist used to dash a ballpoint across a legal pad, slim pen loops to distances she'd mapped on the butcher paper family tree. We used to turn old envelopes inside out. We unstuck seams, smoothed creases. She pressed strips of tape against the folds I held with both hands, not a thought to anyone's answer. I'll never know whose cursive burned when we found metal shards in her azalea, a half shell of duct tape still intact from the homemade bomb. Memphis, you know what can tear through my words when I send them out into this weather.
Thank you. I'm always really interested to know what people are going to pick as the reading, because, you know, just for the listeners, when I ask for reading, I leave it up to the guest to say, which one are you going to read? And almost invariably, the one that they pick is one that kind of stood out to me. This particular poem, so it's part of a series that runs through the book, and indeed that series is the title series for the book itself, Dear Memphis. These are all sort of epistolary poems in direct address to the city of Memphis. And there's a bunch of different things that are going on in these. This particular one, I guess what stands out to me here is that this is one of the most direct and explicit images of violence that happens in the collection. I feel like violence, or the threat of violence, that there is an undercurrent of that runs throughout many of the poems in the collection. But this is one of the poems where it is made very explicit. The bomb in the mailbox. And there's something about this that, well, there's a few things. One is how in this poem, there's this juxtaposition between a violence that is visited from outside, but also this language about, there's this real sort of tenderness that is in this language about things like taking old envelopes and turning them inside out. It's a sort of a tactile language that's used to describe this. And to me, that this is something that has this feeling of care, this feeling of tradition, perhaps, that also runs throughout. And having those two things juxtaposed with each other is really interesting to me. So I guess that might be as good a place to start as any. Does that spark anything for you?
Yeah, I think that's really true. And that's an interesting observation that I hadn't noticed necessarily before or heard before, that this poem holds one of the only instances of like explicit violence on the page. And absolutely, that's true. And there's the difference between the like incidental or accidental destruction of a tree onto a roof versus the intention of a half shell of duct tape still intact from the homemade bomb. And thinking of the envelope turned inside out as one kind of made and remade thing, and also that bomb as a made thing, as something intimate, homemade, just like the envelope. I'm interested in like both kinds of proximity.
There is something, I think, about making, about, what hands can do. I feel like that is something that's interesting to me. And the idea that we can be creative or destructive. And I guess something that I'm thinking about here, and I mentioned that this is one of the few instances of actual like explicit violence on the page in the poems. I do feel like there is an undercurrent of menace that runs throughout that, though. And what's interesting to me here is, let me put this in my own context. I hope that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm a Japanese American person, an Asian American person, and there are ways in which my people, my specific family, and myself, because of that identity, because of that belonging to a marginalized community, have experienced real danger, real oppression. And I think that there are a lot of ways in which reading people who share that identity with me, there can be an impulse to center that, like the fear of that or the pain of that, of having this violence and oppression visited on you by a place that is notionally supposed to be a place that you belong, but that you have to be reminded that you don't. There's a lot of Asian American writing that is about exactly that. What I find that there is not a lot of in Asian American writing is a reckoning with, or even a contemplation of, the ways in which we have a proximity to power, the ways in which we may visit oppression or violence on other communities. And I feel like this is something that's like an applicable comparison to make with many of the poems in this collection, that it would be very possible, and in many ways, I think possibly even very appropriate, to have a collection of poems that is about the pain or the separation or about being victimized. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I don't think that that's what the project of this collection is exactly, because I think that there's a lot more going on here in terms of exploring positionality in multiple directions. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm certainly interested in the ways in which Christian hegemony and white supremacy are forces that are visited upon the speaker, the community at the center of the collection, and like the community that I was raised in. But I'm also so interested in the ways in which we, like the people to whom I belong, the Ashkenazi Jews of Memphis, Tennessee, take those moves, take those forces, and visit them upon others, and employ them for our own elevation, gain, and others' suffering. I think that there is a real danger in holding to a narrative explicitly of oppression or of suffering, because it leads to like a lack of self-criticality, or it can lead to a lack of self-criticality, a lack of self-examination, and a lack of engagement with like the real forces in one's community, and a community that goes beyond those with whom like I share a particular identity, but like how is this community's positionality actually functioning, like materially working in the world in which it exists? That's what was more interesting to me in writing this collection.
I think that it is like, it's not just more interesting, it feels also more necessary to me. I think that, if there's anything about the politics of our present moment, what becomes very clear, I feel, is that kind of everybody feels put upon in some way. Like, no matter like where a person's community or identity sits in the sort of social hierarchy of America, like literally everyone feels put upon. Literally everyone has a grievance. And yet there are so many people who are completely unwilling to look past that and see how do we actually participate in the system in a broader way, what our own complicity is. It's something that's challenging,
Yeah, I think it takes a certain degree of like self-assuredness, of not comfort in the self, but of willingness to be with the self and not be squashed by others' perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree, like the politics of grievance is really exhausting and something that doesn't really make anything happen. And I think what's more necessary, in your words, and I love thinking about the necessary and the possible. To me, those are words that I associate really strongly with Adrienne Rich and her poetry and in prose, honestly. And so thinking about like what is possible and what is necessary from this position. Mm-hmm. Well, for me, a lot of that is in the archive. And for me, a lot of it is also in the lyric. And like what happens when I layer those elements on top of each other.
So one of the things I always consider when I'm looking at a collection, I like to see where it starts and I like to see where it ends, and how that establishes a kind of arc to what the collection as a whole is saying. Not to say that necessarily that there's an argument being made or an explicit message, but just that there is some kind of a narrative, even if it might be like an emotional narrative. But the first poem in this collection does so much to set up so many things, that it includes so many things that are running themes throughout the collection. And I found that really interesting. The poem is called Return, and that in itself is like even just in the title and in the sort of narrative action in the poem, the speaker is returning to this city where she's been gone for a while. You sort of understand. And traversing the sort of physical landscape of the city also comes with a reacquaintance, perhaps, with the emotional and political landscape as well. And you bring in a lot of different things into this poem. Race gets brought in with the comment from the driver, do you have mixed blood? There's the legacy of slavery and its connection to modern day incarceration with the Department of Corrections jumpsuits on people working in the fields. There's the weight of this sort of Christian hegemonic culture where the reference to alabaster crosses, but also a reference to the speaker's parents, making sure that they live among other mezuzahs. And with that, like, I think a question of assimilation versus separation, and why people might do things like that. There's a reference to Martin Luther King Jr., and there's references to inheritance and assimilation. And then, of course, there's the figure of Minnie, who appears in many of the poems. And on the one level, I think that this all sort of plays into that sort of reckoning that we were just discussing, you know, on a sort of an individual level of reckoning with one's own positionality and complicity. But I'm also interested in what a poem does in the world more than just what it is. And I guess I'm wondering, this might be a little bit of a reach, but I wanted to see how it struck you, that I wonder whether or not the poem can be seen as by including all of these things, by sort of getting all of these things within the circle of the poem's arms, perhaps, that, like, I wonder if the poem can be seen as an attempt to form some kind of a community in and of itself. But I wanted to see how that struck you.
I like that as an idea. I like the idea of like constructing a space in which all of these different experiences are swimming together. Another thing that is in Return that people comment on as if it's like throughout the whole book, but really it's not a whole lot, is food. These experiences of interacting with produce and experiencing like height of summer produce in Memphis. And I think all of these pieces have a part in the speaker's experience of the return. I think that the return is a way of landing the reader into the space in the speaker's experience of having left and having come back. Like that, in order to return, one has to have left. So it's sort of a reorientation. And yeah, I like the idea of it as creating a community. It is a poem in sections, which is typically the way that I make long poems, is I stop and start again. And I think that helps in the construction of community, is like having various demarcations and boundaries and places where like one experience of being in a farmer's market can like expand into its own thing. And then on the next page, I can have like the encounter with Minnie, the speaker's former housekeeper, who is throughout the collection. So I think like creating those ends and like the re-beginnings is one way that I can see that like community architecture forming.
It's an interesting thing, this, just to get sort of granular and talk about something as sort of technical as a section break. That poetry, I think, for a lot of people is a form that is very much defined by lineation, which is to say defined by the relationship between the line and the space between the lines. And I think that there is something interesting about the idea of like a stanza. We know the word stanza comes from the word room in Italian, I think, right?
Yeah.
But that here we have boundaries placed between the stanzas, and like the idea of something being delineated, something being separated in this way, but also the way, at least in this poem, this doesn't happen in every poem, but it does happen in more than one poem, that the sections are delineated with a plus sign, which is kind of interesting. Not something that I see a lot of people do, but this way of, addition being, I mean, you could skip right over that, right? Like you could see a plus sign as just like some kind of typographical marker to say there's a space here, there's a break here. It just occurred to me that you could also see it as like being something similar to a cross, I guess. But to me, coming from a technology kind of background, a math background, I'm thinking of it mostly in terms of joining things together. And there's something interesting to me about the idea of joining these separate things together across this gap, which again, I don't know how much of a reach that is, but
no, I feel it. I think of the poems and sections as very much an accumulation process, and the plus signs are intentional. Like I think of them as plus signs. I know people have read them as like akin to crosses, and I make other choices for section breaks in other poems. The little like forward facing caret or reverse caret is also something that I use, and each mark is intentional.
It feels intentional because of the fact that it's not every poem, right? Like it's only a few of the poems that use the plus or that use I was thinking of them as greater than less than signs.
Yeah. That works too.
Yeah. So because of the fact that there is this difference, it does feel very intentional. So you mentioned how a lot of people connect or mention the food imagery and talk about it as though it's something that recurs throughout the poem. It doesn't really recur throughout the poem, but I do find it interesting that this isn't the only poem where there is food imagery. The one that's coming to mind for me is Stoneway North, which
yes,
to me in some ways, maybe not completely, but this one reads like a love poem to me, and it kind of stands out in that way because I don't feel like most of the poems they don't feel like a love poem to me. Whereas this one, there's other stuff going on as well, but particularly because of the direct address, the you of the poem seems to be addressing a lover, is interesting to me. And also because of like the specificity of the food imagery, and in particular how in both Stoneway North and in Return, there is something about food that is, again, one, it is a creative act that like this is something that hands are interacting with. It's also in both cases, these are, symbols of nourishment, but not just nourishment, but also care, that, I mean, I know this is common in many cultures that, when someone is feeling a loss or when someone is down, or just, parents to children, that one of the primary ways we care for each other is to offer each other food. That's really, it's interesting to me that's, that these are two of the poems where that comes in, and I'm not sure where to go from there, but maybe that sparks something for you.
Yeah, I think of Stoneway North as a love poem. I think of it as a poem of love as a made thing, just as a garden is a made thing or a meal is a made thing. and the work of care that goes into it. I'm really interested in making the work of care visible and tending to it in my poems as just another kind of texture of the world.
The idea, I think, of care and how people care for each other, there's a lot of tenderness in both of those poems, in that depiction of care, and in other places as well. Something that occurred to me while I was reading these, so we mentioned the figure, the character of Minnie, the speaker's former housekeeper. Care is something, especially if we think of care as an action, that we, I think, tend to associate with tenderness, with love, and with a feeling of comfort, whether that be a physical comfort in the present or a nostalgic comfort in the past. But I feel like there are very few points at which the poems here are content to let even something as lovely as care to be simple in that way. And I feel like the character of Minnie is a real complicating force in the collection as to showing the ways in which care also can be kind of fraught, I think, because the relationship between Minnie and the speaker, the relationship between Minnie and the speaker's family is kind of fraught as well. There is, at the very least, a question of, class that comes in between. There's a question of, I'm not sure it's actually stated what Minnie's race is in the poems, whether that's made explicit, but certainly, as I'm reading it, I'm imagining her as a Black woman.
Yes.
And that also, brings in a different kind of baggage, I suppose, because they're the image of a Black housekeeper and the Black housekeeper's relationship with a Southern white presenting family's children and things like that. It's got a lot that comes with it,
Yeah.
So that question of how even care can be something that is sort of both emotionally and politically a fraught thing is really fascinating to me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it really is. And I feel that complication of the labor of care throughout a lot of the women in this collection. I think of this collection as having really three mother figures. There's the speaker's mother, the speaker's grandmother, and then Minnie. And each of them has a different relationship with the speaker, and each of them has a different position in terms of their labor of care. And how they relate to that labor of care. I think my work in a lot of these poems was to give that labor space to be seen and experienced in the poems, to put the complications of care on the page. And with Minnie, also something I realized after I finished the collection is that Minnie is the only named character, the only named figure, which I think is right, in terms of like this collection being one in which there are a lot of possessives. The speaker has a lot of my mother, my father, my grandmother, like that kind of relationship. But Minnie does not belong to the speaker. Minnie is her own person. And so negotiating the ways in which I show that on the page was really important to me. Showing her having her own life separate from the speakers and the speakers' families was also important. Like a life that the speaker is not part of is also important to showing just her sovereignty, quite honestly.
Yeah. It's something that, it never feels didactic. It doesn't feel heavy-handed. I feel like the poems call attention to the dynamic and definitely have a point of view about it. It's not that this is presented neutrally, but I think that there is an acknowledgement of complexity that is it's not given a resolution. And I think in a lot of ways, this is something that makes poetry such a lot of times I ask myself, like, why poetry? Why write a poem instead of an essay or a memoir or a novel? And I feel like in every prose form, not always, I mean, fiction has its ambiguities as well, but prose, I feel like in general has a more sort of authoritative quality to it that I feel like wouldn't necessarily be appropriate here. There's something about the way that, we can present something in poetry without trying to answer the questions that feels really important to me. Again, in that question of like, what does poetry do? You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I think the ways that we can hold both like material and emotional contradictions in poetry is really useful in that way. And there certainly are ways in which prose can do that, but the ways in which poetry extends beyond a literal meaning are useful, are a space in which we, at least in this like ending obsessed, results obsessed capitalist frame, can make space for things that just don't fit that.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions that happen in the book. And one of them, that actually, it gets pulled out onto the back cover. It's sort of the heading on the back cover. This, it appears in the poem, Where Else But Here? And the question is, what do I know about exile? That particular poem has other questions in it as well. Another one that really jumped out to me from that one is the question that the speaker asks, am I allowed here? So this poem it's an ekphrastic poem. It's after Jacob Lawrence's Migration series, is a series of paintings that are about the Great Migration, which, if listeners don't know what that is, it is the migration of African Americans from the South to northern cities, particularly cities like Detroit and Chicago, New York, other places outside of the South. Having this poem be, and if I recall correctly, it happens pretty close to the middle of the book as well.
Yes.
Having this be made central enough to where this is the question that's sort of the pull quote for the book, right? Is really interesting to me. And also because the poem is ekphrastic insofar as it is responding to the paintings, but it's not just responding to the paintings, it's also responding to the space and event in which the paintings are experienced, which is also interesting to me. This question of, and again, it comes back to, I feel, a question of positionality, a question of like community, a question of to what experiences of my ancestry or even my current self, what's mine? What can I claim? What spaces am I allowed to be in? I mean, these are questions that for me as an Asian American person, as a person of Japanese American descent, with my own, history of family trauma and trauma from oppression, I ask myself these questions all the time. And I've never come to a satisfying resolution on these questions. And in some ways, I don't know if it's possible, but it's really interesting to me that this is given such a central place in this book. Can we talk about that?
Yeah. The poem is, as you said, in conversation with Jacob Lawrence's Migration series, and also in the space of the museum gallery, holding like the questions of that kind of space alongside the questions that the art itself is raising about space, about expulsion and dispossession. And it is not just a foil for the speaker's experience, but it is certainly a foil for the speaker's experience in that the Migration series presents so many different visions of that movement of Black Americans out of the racial terror of the Jim Crow South. It's 60 panels And yet each one of them is just like 12 inches by 18 inches. So they're small, but there are so many of them. And it's a piece of sequential art. So you can and each one has a caption. So you can kind of read it like a comic book, but each one also like takes up its own space, has its own depiction or interpretation. Some are more abstract than others. Some are more like strictly informative. And I really felt with the kind of turning of the prism that series performs, that Jacob Lawrence performs in that series, that so many different visions of what is referred to as a single historical event is actually, hundreds of thousands of individuals' experiences. So the political conditions of that reality becoming personal experiences is something that resonated really deeply with me as soon as I first saw the series in the summer of 2015. And it just created a container for the speaker's encounter with her own choices and her own departures. I think that question of what do I know about exile is apt for the back cover because it questions like, what is an exile versus a diaspora versus a migration? It's like, what are the conditions of our movement? And how does that impact the ways in which we are able to live and make community? And the gallery is like its own particular type of community. There's a section of the poem that is entirely overheard conversations from the gallery. And like the things that people will say are wild. The things that people will say are also like heard out of context. Mm-hmm. And that idea of like ways in which people respond to art is something that I saw in Morgan Parker's work in her first book, Other People's Comfort Keeps Me Up at Night. And it was a dynamic that had so much spark for me. And so when I was having these encounters with the migration series, and I first saw it in 2015 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And then, and it was on tour. All 60 panels were on tour together, so that they also visited Seattle the next spring. And in between those times and before and after those times, I used the exhibition website created by MoMA, as well to experience those paintings.
I wanted to go back to something that you said just now where you were talking about the ways in which we're tempted to see this as this event, as a single event that happened in a single way and in a single time, and that we have this tendency towards aggregation, but that actually all of this was a lot of individual stories, a lot of individual people. There's a line in that poem that is, to portray the collective requires erasure, which is something that's it's a very potent thing to me. Just to give an example, this sort of question about, the political efficacy of solidarity. I used the term Asian American before, and that's one that has, radical political roots. This idea that, together we, in this American context, that different Asian ethnicities can have more power together. But it's also one that erases the fact that there are really important differences between different Asian American communities within the United States. I feel like there's something here as well in the ways that there's both a way of wanting to identify across differences in a way that could be described as allyship or solidarity or even just emotional resonance, but that also maybe that has a way of erasing individuality that's very important. I feel like this question comes up over and over again in this collection, especially around the question of migration, whether we call it migration or exile or diaspora or whatever, because migration is an image that comes up a lot, whether that is the African American Great Migration in these paintings or the image of the boy on the beach, mm-hmm. or the history of the Jewish diaspora, that perhaps by putting these things all next to each other, we want to see them as the same. And there's a power in seeing them the same. There's a utility and an efficacy in seeing them as similar, as saying, these things bring us together. These are things that I feel with you. But there's also, I feel like, this question of erasure. And that's something I feel like these poems are really interested in, the tension between those two impulses. Can we talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that making that tension visible is one of the types of work that I was trying to do. I think because I am involved in a lot of political organizing and working, like, for example, a lot of my time these days is spent working with other anti-Zionist Jews against Israel's genocide in Gaza and continued occupation of Palestinian lands, the ongoing Nakba. And when even when I come together with other anti-Zionist Jews, there is a utility in calling ourselves by that name. And also there is a flattening that happens when we do that. There's a flattening of perhaps racial histories or migration histories or even like personal beliefs or personal connections to the land of Palestine. And so because that organizing question is a question of language, it becomes a really potent site for poetry, I think, to like investigate and excavate. And while I absolutely employ that language, I also at the same time want to know more about it, want to question it, want to like think through, when is it useful and when am I just like leaning on it because it's easy?
Yeah. I mean, language is something, oftentimes people, poets don't usually do this, but non-poets, even some non-poet writers, can have a way of perhaps dismissing certain questions of language as being merely a semantics rather than substantive. But language oftentimes does actually not only have an effect on other people and have material effects in the world, but also it affects how we think about these things. It is something that can be a really potent thing and not, I mean, even just saying that something, using semantics as a sort of pejorative term is perhaps kind of missing the point a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, I think, like, of course we could spend all of our time on semantics, and that would probably not serve, if we were like in an organizing context, then we wouldn't want to spend all of our time there. But the language we use determines like how people are able to engage with us. So when I ask a question really directly and almost plainly, like, what do I know about exile? I'm trying to lay something out there in a way that a lot of different traditions and lineages could connect with, while also questioning my own perspective and positionality.
Yeah. So I want to switch gears a little bit. I mentioned before, I'm always interested to think about the beginning and ending of a collection. And the last poem in this book, I actually see it as part of a sort of series of poems that happen late in the book. And these are it starts with the Dear Memphis poem that starts with, "You don't just start a fire," and then How Prayer Works, and then Tangier Before Crossing, and then another Dear Memphis poem. It's the one that starts with, "I used to pace the terminal." And then all of those kind of connect down this river to me, mainly because of the figure of the grandmother, who is, again, like she's throughout this, but these poems are in close proximity to each other, also all close to the end of the collection. And inheritance and heritage are things that are really important to these poems, I feel. And, just sort of thinking about my own experience with my grandparents and great-grandparents' generations. At this point in my life, 3 of my grandparents have passed, and one is, she's not really there anymore. And there's a way in which that loss feels like it has sort of severed a connection that I felt to their history, their living history, and in some ways to my own ancestry and heritage. And I feel like this question of, the reason I want to talk about this, because again, inheritance and heritage is a big theme in this collection, particularly the very closing image of Down This River, which is the closing lines of the collection, are literally the speaker carrying the grandmother. And when I think of heritage and inheritance, a lot of it has to do with what we are carrying into the future. What do we carry forward out of that, out of the past, out of our family's history? So can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I think you're right that last section confronts directly the loss of that grandmother and the loss of that. As I said, she's one of, what I think of as 3 mother figures in the collection. So the loss of one of those mother figures and the ways in which she is so bound up with the environment of the place of Memphis. And in that final poem, I did feel the lyric of it really carrying, and the song of it, of the language, the musicality of it, it becomes dominant in a way that I think is useful for holding all those contradictions that we've spoken of. And in terms of like carrying and heritage, there are a lot of poems in Dear Memphis that also hold to the archival and like documentary heritage and history. So I'm really lucky in that my family has a wealth of documentation, and I'm sometimes even inundated by all of this documentation and archive. And I think with Down This River and with several others of the poems that you mentioned, I was trying to think about, well, what isn't able to be captured by the archive? What is missing? What can't outlive the body?
What can't outlive the body? I'm going to have to sit with that one for a second. I guess the other thing that I'm thinking about, you mentioned the grandmother as being one of the mother figures in the collection. That I'm also thinking about, or there's another series of poems that are towards the end. 3 poems, Passage, Stakeout Station, and then Nocturne, which I think are kind of coming at motherhood in a different direction. Or at least, and most explicitly in Nocturne, there's a line, I won't choose to bring a child into this life. And, we don't have to talk about this if this is an uncomfortable thing. I don't like to get into personal questions except as bears on the work. This is in the work. And because, again, inheritance and heritage are such a strong theme in these poems, I think a lot of people, when they think of legacy and when they think of inheritance, and when they think of transmitting something of legacy and heritage into the future, they're mostly thinking of children. So I guess what I'm thinking about is there's a lot in these poems about what of the past is something that is mine to carry, mine to own. There's also, I think, a question that comes up for me with these poems about, of the things that we bring into ourselves from that past, what are the things that we're going to transmit into the future, and how do we go about doing that? And having children isn't the only way to go about doing that. And I feel like I could be misreading this, but I feel like there is something that these 3 poems are maybe not explicitly, but like implicitly engaging with that question, But I wanted to see what you thought about that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that they are explicitly saying that this speaker is not interested in that kind of transmission, or that particular definition of legacy. That this speaker is much more curious about the reverberations of like the personal experience on the community, on like relationships that are not bound up necessarily in a family structure. And I think we see that in like the gardening of Stoneway North, and we see it also in like the relationship with the natural world in a poem like Passage, and thinking about the ways in which one can impact in like a way of sort of concentric circles reverberating out, rather than like a linear transmission of a proverbial bloodline.
I think that this also bears on this question of like what it means to make a home, which, is something that is a big question here. Like, I know that this is something that you've talked about in other interviews, that this collection was originally had a different title. I think it was something like Another Exodus.
Yeah.
But that ended up being too much about things only in one direction, and that it needed to be more about acceptance and taking the risk of what does it mean to create a home. I think there's something about, I don't know, maybe a challenge here to what we think of a home as being tied to a place or a nuclear family or something like that. And this question of what a home could be, I don't know. I'm feeling a little inarticulate here, but do you sort of get where I'm going?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely in line with the question of like broadening the idea of legacy beyond the family toward more of a like question of community or of relational networks of care. That these are constructions through which we make home and we make belonging. That all of these, again, like going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, like all of these are made things. They aren't defaults. They don't just happen. And when we think of them as just things that we are entitled to or things that just happen, that's when like a lot of exclusionary dominating thinking can take root, because we forget the work that goes into them and all of the different ways in which like the natural world has to be involved and other people have to be involved. And we forget to like seek out that reciprocity. Yeah.
There's like about a million other things that I can ask you about, but we should take a quick break and then come back and do the second segment. So for the second segment, I always invite the guests to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
I thought I would talk about letter writing, like writing actual physical handwritten notes addressed to people, sent in the actual mail, tangible objects that travel from one hand to the other.
Yeah. So where would you like to start with that?
Well, I think I'm thinking of this as both an artistic practice and a personal one. I grew up seeing the people around me write letters. My grandmother, who appears throughout Dear Memphis, was always writing letters. And it was hard for me to capture what that felt like, just seeing her constantly in correspondence. It was hard for me to capture that on the page. And so it became very important to the poem that I read at the beginning of our recording, because that was the attempt that felt closest to the proximity to her writing. And for so many women, letter writing, correspondence, has been historically one way in which they can write creatively. It's an opportunity, it's a space in which they were allowed when women's voices and public disclosures have been sidelined or have been silenced. Letter writing has often been available as an alternative. So I don't have like a robust letter writing practice personally, but I do have a nice postcard writing practice. I send postcards back and forth with several friends and have for many, many years. And when I was a kid, I went to a summer camp where we had no telephone access or anything like that. And I had to write letters, mostly to my parents, mostly to my mom, but also to my grandmother and to my brothers who were at a different camp and to friends. So in writing Dear Memphis, I was writing sort of fictitious correspondence. I was writing to a correspondent who could not answer back. Like Memphis can't write me back. But in writing that, I think I opened myself up to the concept of artistic correspondence. And so for the last almost a year now, for the last 10 months, I've been in an artistic collaboration through correspondence with the poet Exile, who's based in Berlin. And we've been writing handwritten letters back and forth about place and placelessness, diaspora, expulsion. And the handwritten letter has become such an expansive space for me to work out thoughts and feelings on the page.
So this collaboration that you're describing, is it something that started off you knowing that it was going to be a collaboration, or did it start off just with a sort of more sort of typical letter just intended as like communication?
No, it started off as the artistic collaboration.
I see.
We wanted to make something together, and we knew that Dear Memphis was coming out, and like there were opportunities for interviews and things like that. But with Emmet, I really wanted us to be on like equal aesthetic footing, where both of our creative minds and lives were being honored. And this is where we landed.
It's interesting, you know, one of the things that's coming to mind for me as I'm hearing you talk about this is kind of two things that are sort of connected. One is just that, you know, I find that for a lot of us that the creative process often is a very solitary endeavor. It's something that, you know, perhaps we might engage with our sort of artistic community in terms of critique or, you know, seeing, you know, having, you know, beta readers or whatever. But the actual work of composition is something that is often done on our own. Even if we're in the same room with someone else, we're sort of still working on our own. And this project that you're describing is, I mean, obviously it's a collaboration, but that seems like to me a very different mode of working. But then the other thing that comes up is that, you know, you were describing the letter writing that your grandmother did and how, especially for women, letter writing was not just a means of communication. And one of the things that I'm thinking about here is, you know, in reading Dear Memphis and also in sort of thinking about some of the other interviews I've seen you do where you talk about your organizing work, I think it feels like both in your poetics and in your organizing work that community is a really big part of that. Asking what community is, or, you know, attempting to build community, asking what belonging is, figuring these things out, and thinking about letter writing as an artistic practice and collaboration as an artistic practice. It seems to me like there's perhaps an aspect of this same thing here of community and connection in the building of the work. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these letters have been the one thing keeping me so grounded in artistic practice for the last 8 or 9 months. I think when we started writing the letters, I was less in the publicity promotion mode with my writing in terms of my own poetry. But once things were really moving for Dear Memphis and I needed to be devoting more time to the publicity and promotion work, the letters kept me grounded in my writing practice. A letter would arrive and I had to answer it. And I don't think that we agreed on any particular timeline before we started writing, but like in the course of writing the letters, we've found that each of us like has a desire to answer the other by the next Shabbat or on the next Shabbat, or like if I receive a letter on a Tuesday or something, then I wanna draft my response that Saturday. So there's a clockwork of it, and a clock that doesn't adhere to any other clock. It's not like the empire's clocks coming in to regiment our work. It's more the correspondence has its own pace that draws us. And of course, as two Jewish poets working throughout our lives, organizing alongside and with Palestinians, our lives have been irrevocably changed in the last 8 or 9 months. Changed like in a way that is contiguous with what came before, but also that is a rupture.
There's something about the idea that you're doing this sort of in some sort of like harmony with a schedule that isn't related to like necessarily related to the workday, but rather to something that is both cultural and sacred. That's really interesting to me. And also just in general, the idea of having a day of rest where you're not doing work, and sort of the difference between labor and creation, if that makes sense. Like there's something about, like we talk about our art in terms of like, we even call it our work, the work, right? But there's something I think that we also recognize is different from our creative work, from what we do in order to make a living. And there's just something about the idea that in the sort of capitalist, milieu that we inhabit, where the idea of taking time to rest is just it's not a thing in this, structure, that the idea of sort of regularly having a time where you can do something that is sort of artistically or creatively or spiritually nourishing. I don't know, that there's something very attractive about that.
Yeah, it is really attractive. And both Amet and I have our Shabbos practices. We're different in our observance, but we both have an observance of that ritual. And so so it makes sense that has come into the shape of our correspondence, as have like all of these different ways of our Jewish living. Our religious life is part of our thinking and our organizing, and it's not separate. Like it's part of the shape of it all. Mm-hmm. And I think that's like an opportunity that letters give us, is to write within the shape of our lives and to encapsulate particular moments. Because even though like I might write a few drafts of the letter itself, once I send it, I'm not editing it. And they're being published as they were when we sent them. And I will say, I've had another exchange where that's not the case, and it's still beautiful and it's still wonderful, but it's different.
It is. The other thing too that I'm thinking about is, that because your writing is, except for perhaps, I guess, the first letter, but since you're writing back and forth in a series, since you're writing back and forth in some kind of extended conversation, that each letter that you're writing is going to involve a response to what came previously. And that also, I mean, it's not entirely different than how a creative practice can work when you're working by yourself, but it does feel different in a lot of ways. And I'm wondering if you find it to be like a particularly different way of working creatively, or whether it feels more sort of harmonious with what you do when you're working on your own.
It feels like it has some more urgency behind it, I think. The obligation or the responsibility to the other, the sense of reciprocity in it is really driving for me. And that's something that is consistent across my day job as a teacher and my life as an organizer and a friend. And I think that sense of reciprocity is really important to me. And so it does spur my writing in a way that's different from even a workshop deadline, which also is a spur and a necessary thorn in my side. I agree that we write in solitary context, but for me, the community is essential. I can't write when I am isolated. In the times of my life when I've been most isolated, I have not written. So I love accountability, and I love the need to bring anything to a workshop group or to a partner. I have two different regular, I guess you'd call them workshop groups, one with one other poet and one with three other poets that meet regularly. And both of them are what keep me writing. So then having this correspondence with Amet has a different texture because we are writing to the other. So there's this sense of intimacy to it, as well as the necessity to continue the conversation.
I'm actually currently working on a new collaborative project.
Ooh.
Well, sorry. That
no,
caught me
say
off
more.
guard.
If you want.
I mean, I don't know if the show needs to be about me and my projects, but yeah, I mean, I'm working on a new podcast with a friend of mine, and hopefully we're going to be launching it pretty soon. We've got a few episodes that are already recorded and produced, and we're working on bringing it out. And one of the things that I'm finding really interesting about the process is, I've been doing this show for 8 years, 8.5 years. And I had a whole other show as well that I did for a year that was a short story podcast where, again, I was kind of working by myself. It's really interesting to me, the idea of making a podcast, making a project where I'm on an equal footing with my partner, right? And one of the things that I find is really different about collaborating on a project is the sort of feeling of surprise that can come in, and also the sort of negotiation that goes on, the sort of I'm not the only decision maker in the process now, but in particular, one thing that has become apparent in making this new project is that I had an idea of what I thought it was going to be like. And I think my partner had an idea of what she thought the part of the project was going to be like. And there's some kind of interesting tension that comes out of the both of us sort of coming together, but also kind of pulling on each other and being surprised. That's the main thing that I was sort of thinking about, right? This being surprised at things happening in the project that aren't what I planned, and aren't necessarily things that I even put into it, right? Because I'm working with somebody else. And it just strikes me that is something that is going to be similar about any collaborative project, any collaborative creative work, that because you're not doing the whole thing by yourself, there's a lot more opportunity for surprise to come in and for things to go in a different direction than maybe what you thought they might. But I'm kind of wondering, because I mean, people also do talk about in their solo creative work, you know, writing into surprise, writing to find out what it is that the thing is going to be, that there might be things that you didn't realize at the outset. And so I'm wondering if that is something that rings true to you, that it's that there is an increased opportunity for surprise in a collaboration, or whether it feels more similar to you.
Oh, I definitely agree that there's an increased opportunity for surprise. The more factors, it's like adding an extra variable in, an extra mind. And there's Ahmed and I have talked about it, and we've just finished writing an introductory essay to accompany the first 12 letters that are being published. So it's fresh in my mind. But there's like my gravity of my life and their gravity of their life. And then the letters have their own gravity. And we're all in orbit together. We're all affecting each other's orbit. And there's also like the element of surprise of the mail itself. Like, when is the letter going to arrive? We don't know. We have to check the mailbox. And it always reminds me of James Merrill's poem, Lost in Translation, which, like, in the very opening of it, he's a child, and the speaker is a child waiting for a puzzle to come in the mail. And it's something along the lines of, something about the puzzle keeps never coming. Daylight shines in or lamplight down upon the tense oasis of green felt, full of unfulfillment, life goes on. And this is just the beginning of a long poem, but I think of this all the time, like the tense oasis of green felt waiting for the puzzle to come, or my desk waiting for a letter to arrive. My little altar shelf waiting for another letter to join the pile of them.
There's something for me. I mean, I guess even in a show like this one, it's not entirely that I'm making it by myself, because I'm talking to another person, and I never know exactly what my guest is going to say. I might, because I do a fair amount of preparation beforehand, I might have some idea of what they're likely to say, but you never know for sure. And especially because I don't plan the second segment, there's always a lot of opportunity there. There's just something about making something with somebody else where the sort of power dynamic is much more on an equal footing, that it's really different to me anyway. It's very fascinating. And the ways in which there's sort of a push and pull, I think, is interesting. The ways we work towards each other and away from each other is just, it provides such a different dimension, or it makes it more explicit, more obvious how those things play out. I don't know if you feel that as well in your project.
Yeah, I definitely feel it in some ways, but in some ways our work, while like there are certain parts of it, the publication of it, namely, that we work on like together simultaneously, the project itself, the like creation of the letters, we do independently. So I am writing my letter to Emmet and sending it. And then we're waiting, and then they're writing their letter to me and sending it. And there's like the connection between us is driving that back and forth, that exchange. But it's only when we're, say, pitching publications or drafting an email together, or like we were this morning, revising an introductory essay to accompany the letters, that we're like working on it in tandem and negotiating those boundaries, those those tensions. And this is the first time that I've collaborated with somebody like that on something artistic. Like, I obviously collaborate with other teachers all the time and with other artists in creating events often. But this was the first time I had ever co-written an essay that was a creative essay. And I think each partnership or collaboration, maybe it's more than two people, probably has to figure out its own means and its own terms. Like, how are these 2 or 4 or 8 individuals going to be able to work together?
Yeah.
Like, that's how it works in organizing. We have to like know each other in order to know how to work together.
Yeah.
Even if we have a shared goal, and even if we are honoring a diversity of tactics, like, we have to know what the other needs and what the other wants in order to collaborate.
Yeah. It's something that I think a lot of people don't realize, either who are not in organizing spaces or perhaps are new to organizing spaces. It's just how much of that work is really about personal relationships. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's so relational. And that's why I think it's really, really important to treat each other well. I know that might sound really obvious and even pedantic, but in my 20s, I was in a lot of organizing spaces where people treated each other really badly. And
there's a lot of that.
Yeah, and like did so supposedly for the sake of the cause, and excused a lot of bad behavior and I think, like, honestly, I think a lot of like political campaigns, like electoral campaigns, do this, where they see their organizing as a means to an end. But I really, really am drawn to groups and people who see their organizing as an extension of who they are and will not allow that bad behavior to take root.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so
hard.
important. It is hard. It's very hard. Going back to the letter writing thing, one thing I'm thinking about is, you mentioned that these letters that you're writing they're handwritten on paper. They go through the mail. And it's such an interesting thing because like so little of the communications that we have these days involve any kind of a physical medium, right? Like something, whether it's like a text message or an email or a voicemail or even a podcast, there's nothing tangible about it. And something that I think a lot about, this is something that comes up for me as a photographer sometimes, that sort of the difference between taking pictures with a digital camera versus taking pictures with a film camera. And one thing that is, some people would argue, is maybe not that important, but to me, it does feel very different. That when you take a picture with a film camera, the negative, maybe not the print, but the negative was in the same physical space as the subject of the photograph. That like literally the photons that bounced off of the subject also bounced off of the film. And there's something about that as an artifact that makes it not just feel different, but to me, like, be different and mean something different. And it strikes me that it's very similar with the idea of a handwritten letter, that this is something that your hands touched, and then you took that thing that your hands touched, put it in the mail and sent it to your partner, who then their hands touch it. And then the same thing in reverse. And I wonder whether or to what extent that makes the project either feel different or be different or mean something different for you.
Oh, yeah. I think it totally has that contagious magic that exists when something is like touched by those hands or touched by that light. I love that image of the photons that bounce off the subject also have touched that film, that negative. My grandfather was a photographer and he used slide film always. And I have some of his slides that my cousin made into a lampshade for me. And I adore them. But the film having been in the camera is so magical. And in the case of my correspondence with Ahmed Ezel, like, we have never met in person, but we have held this same paper so many times. They have written their letters on paper and, addressed envelopes to me, and then I get them and I know that they have held them. And it's such an intimate act. And I think writing postcards with friends for so many years, I knew that, but it became particularly important in the spring of 2020, in early lockdown days, when I was dealing pretty well. I was just like nose down teaching online, like really focused on staying safe and doing good teaching and taking care of my students. But some other people in my life who were far away were having a really, really, really hard time. And were having moments of like deep despair and panic and wanting to like jump on a plane or get in the car and drive cross country. And me saying that's absurd was not helpful at all. But what I could do in that moment was write them an actual letter, was like put pen to paper and mail something from my house to theirs. And it wasn't me and it wasn't like what they wanted, but it was a better replacement than a phone call or a video call. It was tangible.
Yeah. That tangible aspect to all of these things. I think that there's often an argument that what's important is the content of the medium, right? That the medium itself isn't the important part of things. And it's not an argument that I'm completely in disagreement with, or that I don't see, the merit of it. But there is something just different about when something is a physical, when there is a physical artifact. And I always wonder, how much of it is just like me and my own sort of sentimentality and how attached to memory and history and things like that I am personally, versus sort of like in a more philosophical, like the ontology of what a thing is, but I don't, and I've never fully been able to settle that for me, but it does feel really different when there is a physical artifact that is the product of these actions, I guess. And it's funny that because I feel so strongly about that, and yet almost all of the creative things that I do are done digitally. So
it is interesting that those tangible things have an attraction. They have something that we can't resist. And because I'm the oldest of four and I'm constantly thinking about myself in relation to my three brothers, I think about them and much of their daily labor, the work that they do is digital. Much of it, not all of it, but a large percentage of it is digital, and yet they each have really tangible hobbies, really tangible pursuits that they engage in outside of those day jobs of, they do pottery and they draw and they do carpentry and play ultimate frisbee even in, after age 30, which I feel like is inadvisable given the shoulder stuff that happens to ultimate frisbee players, but that's just me. Anyway, I just see this as having this drive to connect to our own bodies and needing something in relief to them. whether that is, the charcoal on the drawing paper or like the saw in the wood or the clay in the hand.
Yeah.
Like there's this desire to physically interact with a medium.
Yeah. Well, I think we're about at time. There's one question that I always like to close with, and that is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yes. I just got the newest issue of Agni, and which is a literary journal, and the poem 50 Mothers by Preeti Vangani in it is just fantastic. Actually, I think they published it as nonfiction, but to me, it is a prose poem. It is so rapturous in its fantastical language that is so grounded in material reality. It sparks and it shimmers. And I've seen her perform it live, and honest to God, the audience rushed the stage after.
Wow.
It is transcendent. And so 50 Mothers by Preeti Vangani.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that happen at a reading before.
When something that wild comes out, everybody wants it.
Yeah.
And everybody wanted her.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. Thanks so much, Mike.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are purchase links in the show notes for Dear Memphis. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, I do highly recommend picking up a copy for yourself. There are also links to Rachel's website, as well as their correspondence with Exile, published in the journal Agni. Do check those out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shay Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider supporting the show by making a pledge to our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. There are links in the show notes for that, and you can find all of the show's contact information, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechannelopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back with a new conversation next month, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.